Hi everyone! So today we're going to be talking about all things Leca, but before we get into it, I do want to remind you guys that for these types of videos, I do timestamp them down below so that should you need to re-reference a specific part of the things that we're going to talk about today in the future, you can easily jump to that part of the video, so just keep that in mind. But basically, earlier last year, I did begin experimenting with Leca for the very first time, and I am here to tell you guys I actually quite like it. I will explain more as we go along today what it is that I like about it, and we are going to talk about some of the things that can be a little bit problematic with it as well, but let's just go ahead and get right into it. And so I just want to start off explaining kind of what is Leca. So Leca stands for Lightweight Expanded Clay Aggregate. So basically Leca are little clay balls, and the nice thing about these is that they can absorb and hold up to about 30% of their weight in water. So basically growing plants in Leca is what is known as passive hydroponics. Sometimes you will hear people refer to it as semi-hydroponics, but really it's just passive hydroponics. And what that means is in regular hydroponics, usually people have an entire pump system set up where the water is kind of being circulated in and out of the system continuously. Usually there's air stones involved that are pumping extra oxygen into the water. And so with Leca, what we're doing is we're basically taking that active process of circulation and adding that extra oxygen out of the equation, and we're just growing basically in the Leca with water being absorbed up through that Leca and serving that up to the plant's roots. Now, what are the benefits to this? Well, one of the number one benefits that most people really like about this is it tends to lead to less pest problems, specifically fungus gnats, because fungus gnats breed and lay eggs in the soil in plants, and that's when you start to have crazy problems in your house with fungus gnats. Because there is no soil in this process, the fungus gnats typically are not going to be able to really kind of take over. That doesn't mean you're not going to necessarily have a fungus gnat or two around your house still, but they shouldn't be able to cause a serious infestation like they do with soil. Now, another added benefit to using Leca is that it allows for more aeration and oxygen to the root system of the plant. And when we have that, that typically will lead to a lower occurrence of root rot. Now, I want to be clear right now, I am not at all saying that root rot will not happen if you're growing plants in Leca. It can still happen, but the likelihood of it happening is greatly reduced. Now, there are three primary methods for growing plants in Leca. The first is what is known as submerged no drainage. This is honestly one of the easiest methods to use to get started with Leca, because basically it just involves finding a container that has no drainage whatsoever and can hold liquid, adding your Leca and your plant to it. And then by submerged, what we mean is part of the Leca and part of the roots are actually submerged in water. So our water line for this one is right around here right now, and I will explain as we go along today how to know where to put that water line and everything else. But this is a super simple way to get started with Leca. Now, the second method is basically drainage submersion. So you're still submerging part of the Leca in the water or nutrient solution. I will explain the nutrient solution here in a bit, but you have drainage. So for example, you can see here that I have a pot with drainage inside of a pot with no drainage, but I still have the water level coming up and covering part of the Leca. And then the third primary method is what is known as drainage with wicking. And there's actually two ways that this can occur. You can either have a pot with drainage where part of the pot extends down and some of the Leca sits into that extended part of the pot, and only that Leca that is in that extended part of the pot comes into contact with that nutrient solution, and basically it wicks that up and spreads it to the Leca above it. Now, another common setup for wicking actually involves the use of a cotton or a microfiber wick, where the wick is wound up partially into the Leca, and then the ends of the wick go down into that nutrient solution, and it wicks the water up into the Leca. Now, I will explain the pros and cons of each of these methods here in a bit, but I kind of need to explain to you how to actually use Leca first, or else my pros and cons aren't really going to make sense. But if you are looking to get started in using Leca, the first thing you need to do is decide what kind of Leca you're going to buy. Now, there are a lot of different brands out there. There's even some kind of variations in types of Leca, but after doing my research, I decided to go with Mother Earth's original hydrogen Leca. Now you can buy this on Amazon. I do have it linked to my Amazon storefront, and the link to that storefront can be found below in the description. I ended up buying accidentally a way bigger bag than I really needed at the time, so pay attention to the size bag that you are getting. But once you have figured out which leca you want to use and you get it in, you need to prep it for use. This is a very, very important step. Leca is dirty, 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 dirty when you first receive it, and you need to thoroughly clean it off before use, or you're just gonna have mucky, muddy type water, and that is not good for your plant. So once you do receive it, you're going to want to give it a thorough rinse off. Do not do this in your kitchen sink, you guys. It is clay, once again, and all of that dust that you are going to be rinsing off of it can accumulate in the bins in your pipes and turn into actual mud and clog up your pipes. So it is really ideal to take it outside and ideally use a garden hose, or if you don't have a garden hose, fill up a pot of water, put your leca into a colander and just flush that leca really, really thoroughly. Now, once you have done this, you can just let it dry completely out and then store it away if you're not ready to use it right away. However, if you are looking to use it right away, or if you've stored it and now are ready to use it, you need to rehydrate the leca thoroughly before you use it. So basically, you're gonna wanna soak your leca submerged completely in water for at least 24 hours, you guys. Personally, I have found that 24 hours will do the trick. A lot of other people like to do what they call the double submerge, where they submerge it for 24 hours, they dump all the water out, then they resubmerge it again for another 24 hours. It's really up to you, you guys, but once again, I have not had a problem with just letting it sit for 24 hours. But basically, the reason you want to do this is even though leca will wick water up into the leca from the reservoir that you're using, it won't happen super thoroughly if the leca is completely dry, and you don't want the roots that are at the top to be sitting there drying out completely. So you want that leca to have already absorbed 30% of its water weight, which is how much it typically absorbs anyways, before you put the plant into the leca, and the only way to really accomplish that is to pre-soak your leca. Now let's talk next about prepping plants to put into leca. So we have to talk about multiple things here because honestly, your prep is going to depend on a number of factors. But let's start with the easiest transition to leca. So the easiest transition to leca is to take a plant that you've been propagating in water and just pot it straight up into leca. The reason this is so easy is because the plant has already developed water roots, which is what you need the plant to have in order to really survive and thrive in leca. So it's already been primed to be moved to leca. I have had absolutely no problem with any plants that I have transitioned that were water props to leca. So for example, this is a Syngonium albo. Actually, it's two Syngonium albos that I potted directly up in a submerged, no drainage situation into leca from water. And they have done absolutely fine. I've had no leaf loss. The roots look good. There's no root loss going on. It really is one of the smoothest transitions, you guys. So ideally, if you can, that is the way to go. But if you're wanting to, for example, start transitioning your collection into leca, maybe because you have a massive fungus gnat infestation and you're over it, whatever it may be, this is not going to be the likely situation for you. You are likely going to be having to go through a slightly more complicated process depending on the plant. So let's actually talk about what plants work in leca versus plants that won't work in leca. And I don't want to say won't work. Theoretically, you guys, you can probably grow almost any plant in leca if you wanted to, but the question of whether or not they're going to thrive in leca, that's really the key question. So first of all, plants that can grow solely in water, and I do have a video about that I'll link below in the description for you as well. Plants like that typically will take to leca fairly well. Additionally, plants with more robust root systems tend to do better in leca, so big, thick, chunky roots, but also they need to be plants typically that will grow roots really quickly. So if we look at the opposite of that, plants that typically won't do well in leca are plants that have very shallow root systems that don't grow fast at all. Plants with super sensitive roots also are not going to do well in Leca, and that has a lot to do with the fact that you have to handle plants that are in Leca a lot more often. So they're getting jarred around, and those Leca balls are getting shifted ever so slightly when you are dealing with the plants. And so as they're shifting, they're also bumping against those roots. So if it is a very fine, fragile, sensitive root system, that's going to cause a lot of trauma and can cause that plant to have issues. So just keep that in mind. It really is kind of, you guys, you have to kind of, I guess, use what you know about your plants and what you've observed about your plants sometimes to really kind of figure it out. There are just so many plants out there that for me to try to list every single one that would work well in Leca and not would be like impossible. Well, I mean, it would be impossible, but we'd probably be here for 8 hours. But if there is a plant that you're curious about, a specific plant, just comment down below and let me know and I will help you out. But the key thing to know is also plants that are in soil that are younger and less established tend to handle the transition a little bit better. So for some plants, you may find that you can successfully just take them straight out of soil and into Leca without any in-between stage. But for more mature plants that are more established, or plants that might be a little bit more sensitive to that type of transition, there's an in-between step that you're gonna have to do. So I'm gonna go into that a little bit more now, but first step, regardless, any plant you are taking from soil or any type of soil-based substrate basically into Leca, the first thing you've got to do is get all of that substrate off of those roots. And when I say all, I mean all. The reason you've got to get all that substrate off is because if you have even a little bit on there, you've got to remember we are now going to be growing this plant in a water-rich environment, if you will. And even though the roots themselves, when they're clean and free of that old substrate, may be okay with that because they have enough oxygen and everything, if you have a little bit of soil stuck on that root and it is in contact with wet Leca, the soil is going to retain more moisture than the root or the Leca. And that is going to lead to a potential root rot situation in the point where that soil sits on that root. So you got to think about it this way. The Leca itself, like I said, only holds up to 30% of its weight in water. So it is not completely wet versus soil, which can hold up to, I forget, depends on the type of substrate, you guys, but it holds like sometimes up to 5 times as much water as its own weight. So it is going to stay much wetter, much longer. That's why you really got to get all of that substrate off. If it comes down to you're having a hard time getting it all off, you may need to prune the roots that you can't get it off of the plant, just to be sure that you're not going to have a potential rot type problem. Now, once you get all of the soil off, you guys, frequently you will discover that that root system was way bigger than you thought it was. So case in point, this is a plant that I decided to take straight from soil into Leca because Syngonium love to grow in water. They root very quickly, and as you guys are probably familiar with, they will shoot roots even when they're in soil, shoot roots straight to the bottom and out of the bottom of the pot over no time. And so for that reason, I find that they transition pretty well to water-based growth. They also root crazy fast when you're propagating them in water. And so I decided just to take this plant, which is fairly established, by the way, you guys. I did do that with another Syngonium, this one here, that was less established, so we'll compare right now the two. So I just got all of the substrate off of this, and as you guys can see, the root system, I couldn't even believe how long it was, you guys. This was in a 4-inch pot. That is a lot of roots to be in a 4-inch pot. And part of the reason it didn't look like that much when I first started unpotting this plant is because they were so tightly wound together. But as I gently and slowly unwound those roots and got all that substrate off, I was just shocked at how long the root system was. I wasn't planning on going into a vessel this large, but I had to because of how many roots there were. Now, I went ahead and I will explain here in a bit the exact process for potting up based on each of the methods that I talked about earlier. But I got this potted up, and I knew that I was probably going to experience some strange things. So the first thing I knew that was probably going to happen was I was going to lose some leaves, and I did. I think I've lost about 8 of the oldest leaves around the bottom here, but you can see the rest of these leaves look fine. It's been pushing out new growth. I can still see in the very middle right now some new leaves coming in. Now the other thing I knew was probably going to happen was that some of the roots were going to die off. So this is another thing I need to remind you guys about. And I don't want you to fully panic if this happens. If you do decide that a plant can probably tolerate going straight to Leca without the in-between stage that we're going to talk about in a second. Do not panic when you start to see roots die off in there. Root death can happen naturally and not because it's root rot. You have to keep that in mind. So this plant has been killing off some of these roots. Let me see if I can find a good spot to kind of demonstrate that for you. If I have to do some secondary footage, I will, but there are some roots that are kind of turning brown and looking almost like a root rot situation and kind of dying off, but that's not unexpected. And the reason that this happens is because these are soil roots. These roots grew in soil. They are not water roots. Now, some soil roots on some plants will adapt water better than others, but frequently you will have die-off. How significant that die-off is and how much of those soil roots die off really depends on the plant. But not to fear, because what will start to happen is we will start to get new water roots. You can see that bright white brand new root that has started to develop here. The plant will start to develop water roots to replace those roots that are dying off. So it is okay to have some die off in here. I will explain later on when die off may be of concern and you may need to actually do something about it. But for this plant, this is not unexpected. There's no sign that it's actually like root rot, because if it was, I would be seeing a lot more problems going on up here on the foliage. So this is just a natural occurrence. Okay, so I'll set this one aside. Now, like I said, this is a younger plant that I took into this. This plant had not been potted up that long. And honestly, you guys, when I took it out of the pot, it hadn't developed any like new roots in soil. So I have a feeling that this plant was originally started in water and it just hadn't fully developed soil roots yet. So yeah, it should have a pretty easy time transitioning to Leca. Now, it hasn't been in here for very long. This is one of the most recent ones that I transitioned, but you can see we are starting to lose a leaf. Not unexpected. That will happen. Don't panic. But the roots still look okay in here. And I think it's been in here for 2 weeks now, I believe. And so I'm just waiting. I know that's what's going to happen is these roots are going to start to develop some secondary water roots. I say secondary water roots because once again, I'm pretty sure that these were water roots to begin with when I potted it up into soil. But so far so good. It has put out a new leaf, so we're doing good. Okay, now for more mature, more established plants or plants that you just feel like might not handle the transition as well. And once again, you just kind of have to judge it based on the plant. If you're curious, once again, comment down below with the specific type of plant you have a question on and I will let you know. Or if you're just nervous about it in general, then I recommend taking this next in-between step from removing all of the substrate off of it before you put it into Leca. And basically what you're going to do is you are going to sort of propagate the plant, if you will, without removing the soil roots. You are just going to take that entire root system and you are going to put it into water. Now, you're not just going to put it into water because we want to try and encourage those water roots to happen a little bit more quickly. We also want some kind of nutrients in the water to be able to support all of the foliage so that you don't lose all of the foliage. And so when we do this, you have multiple options you can do here, but honestly, I find the easiest thing to do is just to add a little bit of rooting hormone to the water that you're putting the plant into. Now, ideally, a liquid-based rooting hormone would probably work best because it's going to incorporate with the water better. I had the powdered-based rooting hormone on hand, so that's what I have used, and it's worked okay. A liquid one would probably work maybe a little bit quicker, but it's what you have on hand. That's what you're going to use, unless you really just want to go spend money on something new, which I didn't. But I decided to do this with my Philodendron El Choco Red because I decided that I really would rather have it in Leca than soil, just because of some of the stories I have read from other people who have had this plant. Seems like a lot of people have had success growing it in Leca. And also my soil roots, because this was an imported plant, the soil roots on this plant, I actually think were moss roots. I think this was cut off of a moss pole. And I find that moss roots sometimes don't take to my aeroid mix as well or as quickly as I would like to. So I decided to go ahead and put this plant into water and start this process of transitioning it to Leca. So I did put the rooting hormone in there as well. I did not remove any of the roots that were on there. However, if you do find that there are roots that look like they're dying off or are dead or have a little bit of rot, definitely remove those before you put the plant into water. Now, what's going to happen when you do this? You are probably still going to have some leaf loss. My plant did lose 2 of its 3 leaves, which I knew was going to happen, but I just accepted that. Then these roots that were soil roots are either going to start to slough off and die, and you're going to need to remove them weekly when you change out that water. So make sure you're changing out that water and that rooting hormone once per week. When you do that, check for those roots that are dying off, remove them so you don't have anything funky going on in the water. And beyond that, some of the soil roots will just sit there doing absolutely nothing, you guys. Lots of times, soil roots will not develop secondary roots in water. Some plants they will, most plants they won't. But over time, what you will find happens, as you can see here, new water roots will start to develop. So I have at this point, as you just saw, removed a lot of the soil roots that were on there because I didn't need them anymore. We're starting to get the water roots. They were just sitting there doing nothing anyway. So I went ahead and removed them because I also wanted to encourage those water roots to grow more quickly. And by removing those soil roots, now that plant's going to be thirstier because it doesn't have anything to help absorb up that water other than those new roots that it's forming. So I have found that in the last week since I did that, those new water roots are growing more quickly. So that is what you want to see. Once those water roots start to come in, you really want to wait until the primary water roots start to grow new roots off of themselves. That is what we refer to as secondary water roots. And then at that point, once the root system has gotten big enough to look like it's going to support the amount of foliage you have above, then you can start transitioning it to Leca. Now, what do I mean by enough to support the foliage above? If you've got this much foliage on a plant and you've only got 3 water roots that are about this long, that's not going to cut it unless it is a fast rooting plant, which honestly, in the case of Syngonium, it might work. But ideally, you want it to be at least like 1/3 of the size of what's above it would be my recommendation. Then you can move it to Leca. And the transition to Leca should be pretty smooth because basically we've just turned it into a water propagated plant, if that makes sense. Now, how long that process will take just depends on the specific plant in question and the conditions in your home. Obviously, you want to make sure it's getting enough light. It is in a nice warm environment, not too cold, not too hot. You want to make sure that it's got good humidity if you're able to do that. If you are not able to give it extra humidity, that's fine. It just may take a little longer for those roots to develop. Some plants, it can happen in a matter of weeks. Some plants, it may take a few months. So you'll just have to be patient. Okay, let's talk about how to actually pot up Leca next. So regardless of what method you're using, submerged, no drainage, submerged drainage, or drainage with wicking, you're going to want to take the actual vessel that you're going to be putting the Leca and the plant into, and you want to fill it up about 1/3 of the way with Leca first. Then you're going to position the plant in there, get it nice and centered, get all the roots tucked in, and you're going to start to fill it back in gently with the Leca until it is all the way filled in. Now, quick note about positioning the plant in the Leca. You want to make sure that you are not getting too much of the base of the plant here in that Leca. You don't want that to be too far down because if that stays too wet, then you potentially will have stem rot or crown rot, and we definitely don't want that to happen. So just a little bit below, honestly, looking at this one, it is like not even, I mean, there's like 2 pieces of Leca sandwiching the base of that before the roots start. So that is really not even remotely in the Leca, if you will. With this plant, it is a little bit more in there, but once again, just barely. I'd say it's about 1/4 to 1/2 an inch below the Leca line. But the thing is, you guys, this Leca on the surface typically stays relatively dry. And so that way we're not having that sitting in so much moisture that is potentially going to rot. So just keep that in mind. Set this back. Now, once you've done that, you are going to add in your nutrient solution, and I'm going to explain to you next exactly what I mean by nutrient solution. But when you are adding it into these plants, depending on which method you're using, it's going to be a little bit different. I don't know why I just set that down because I need to show it to you again. So if you are in a no drainage submersion system, you're going to want to fill your vessel up with your nutrient solution until it is about 1/3 of the way up the roots. Do not go higher than 1/3. We don't need to be submerging the roots completely here. Now, you guys, some people will say that you are not supposed to let the roots be in the nutrient solution at all. Here's the thing, you guys. The roots grow quickly. They're going to grow downwards. Eventually, they're going to be in the nutrient solution. So unless you wanted to try to repot this every week or 2 weeks practically to get the roots back up above that level of the nutrient solution, which I don't recommend, that's going to cause way too much stress to your plant that it doesn't need, don't worry about it. don't worry about it at all. This is a semi-hydro method of growing, and remember, in actual hydro, the roots are actually in the solution. So 1/3 of the way up the roots, and that is it. Now, when it comes to submersion with drainage, basically the same rule applies. You're gonna wanna get that solution about 1/3 of the way up the roots as well. Now, for the wicking method, you're not going to submerge the leca. Well, I take that back. If you have one of the pots, like I said, that extends part of the pot down into the water reservoir that's holding the nutrient solution, you just want that extended part of the pot to be what goes into the nutrient solution. Everything above that extended pot should not be submerged. If it is something with an actual wick, same thing, only the part of the wick that is coming through the pot that has the actual drainage goes into that nutrient solution. Okay, so let's talk about the nutrient solution next. I do have some notes just to make sure I don't forget anything, because there were just a lot of things when I was planning out this video where I was like, oh, I can't forget to tell them this, I can't forget to tell them that. Okay, so the reason that we're using a nutrient solution, first of all, is because with plants in soil, the soil itself has nutrients in it. And so basically we just fertilize, usually if you're me, once a month, especially in the winter, maybe twice a month in the summer, to kind of help supplement what's not in that soil. However, when we are working in a passive hydroponic system, such as Leca, there are no nutrients just in the Leca itself. So we have to provide all of the nutrients for the plant within that liquid that we are giving to the plant, within that water. So that being said, there are different types of nutrient solutions. There's a really popular one out there that is a 3-part system. It includes a part that is for bloom, a part that is micronutrients, a part that is for grow, and basically you combine all these together to make your nutrient solution. However, there are other solutions out there that don't involve a 3-part system. I did opt myself to go with one of those that doesn't involve that, and I will explain why in a second. But important thing to know here is that when you are doing passive hydroponics, you have to be really careful about the pH of your solution. So one of the first things you really need to do is get a simple, cheap pH testing kit off of Amazon. I will have linked one to my Amazon storefront down below for you. I basically used this to test my tap water just to see where the pH was just naturally. And honestly, you guys, I was a little shocked that my pH for my tap water was kind of perfect. Also was shocked that apparently, even though I have hard water, it's not as hard as I thought it was. A lot of the readings when I did this test, I was like, whoa, I probably can get away with using my tap water to water my plants instead of filtering it first. But that's for another video. So basically you want to check your pH of your water first. If it is within range, which is about 5.5 to 6, that is the range that you really want for your plants. Now, the problem is with some of these nutrient solutions or some of these nutrients that you can add to the water, they will shift the pH. So once you have mixed it up, you have to then test the pH again. And then lots of times you have to buy what is known as pH up or pH down and add that little by little to that nutrient solution to get the pH just right. Now, ideally, once you've done this once, you then know how much you have to do it each time and you don't really have to test every single time. But honestly, you guys, that just seemed like a big old headache to me. So I decided to use the nutrient solution that Pretty in Green sells. It is only a 2-part system. It includes the, I believe hold on, Bloom and Grow. Yes, Bloom and Grow, but the nice thing about their solution is that it is also pH stabilized so that it shouldn't change the pH of your water. And of course I did test it and it did not shift my pH. So I find it to be a lot simpler of a solution. The other problem with nutrient solutions is that you have to be careful about how you mix them. So you can't combine the 2 nutrients together and then add them to your water, because what happens, or 3 nutrients if you're using the 3 nutrient system, what can happen is they will bond to each other and now they aren't their own individual nutrients, and that leads to what is known as nutrient lockout, where because now it's a completely different compound, your plant can actually absorb it at all and can't use it. Also, you guys, nutrient lockout can happen if your pH is off, so that is the other reason that is really important to check the pH and make sure that it is correct. Now, with this system that I'm using, it's not as sensitive, I guess is the way to say it. I still have to add part A first to the water, stir it up, Then I have to add part B to the water and stir it up. It is a 1:2 ratio. So basically I'm using 1 part of part A, and then for however much that is, I use twice that much of part B. I will go into that a little bit more here in a second. But if I use like the same pipette or eyedropper or whatever I'm using to combine it, I can just simply do a quick rinse of what I'm using to combine it before I do the next nutrient, and it's not going to be a problem. However, what I have heard from the popular 3 nutrient system is basically you need to use a different dropper or pipette or whatever you're using for each of those solutions, or you need to thoroughly clean it in between each one with soap and water, or you might end up with nutrient lockout. I don't know about you guys, but I don't have time for that. So that is part of the reason that I went with the system that I did. So real quick, in case Pretty and Green is watching this, my apologies for the fact that your labels look like crap in this video. I did not realize if I got them wet that the ink was going to run. But you guys, basically you're going to start with part A, and for this particular solution, you're going to use 2 to 6 milliliters per gallon. You're just going to add that into the water, and then you're going to make sure that you thoroughly stir that in before you add part B. So like I said, part B is 2 times of however much you added of part A, so that would be 4 to 12 milliliters per gallon. And once again, once you've added it in, just make sure you stir it in really well, and then the nutrient solution is good to go. Now, you might be wondering why there's a range in terms of the amount of the nutrient solution that you're going to use. So you kind of want to gradually introduce your plants to this nutrient solution because remember, they're not used to growing in this yet. So you want to start out towards that lower end and then over time increase it up more and more, either all the way up to the highest end, or if you find your plants doing great somewhere in between, just stop somewhere in between. I'm doing the in between at this point on all of my plants and they are doing just fine. So next, you guys, let's talk about ongoing maintenance when growing in Leca. So we, at this point, have gotten our plants successfully transitioned into Leca. We've given them their first batch of nutrient solutions, so now what? So basically you need to keep an eye on the water levels for your plants, and you want to keep those water levels maintained over the course of about 2 weeks. So you can do several things here. Some people like to, as that water level starts to drop, to do a full rinse, dump that out, and then just give it regular water with no nutrient solution in between. So let's say, for example, we give it nutrient solution today, a week later we notice the water levels dropped halfway. You can go rinse that out and just put regular water in until another week goes by, and then you'll want to reintroduce the nutrient solution again, or you can do what I do and I just top it off, because honestly, once again, I don't really have time for that, and it will not hurt your plant to do this, you guys. So you can just go around and top off the water level with just regular water, not water with nutrient solution, in that in-between phase over the course of that 2 weeks. But once every 2 weeks, and sometimes you guys, you may find you go a little bit longer than 2 weeks, it's not going to be the end of the world, but I would recommend not going longer than once a month doing a full flush on your plants, but ideally you really want to do once every 2 weeks. So when I talk about a full flush, what is a full flush and why do we do a full flush? Well, one of the reasons you want to do a full flush is because just like with plants grown in soil, minerals and things can get deposited and kind of build up over time. And when that happens, lots of times you guys will see white growth of stuff on top of your Leca. So let me use this as an example, and it just came off all over my finger, but that's okay. Let's do this camera. So hopefully you can see there is this white buildup of stuff, and this is like powdery. It's all over the top of my Leca. I have had people mistakenly think this is mold. This is not mold, you guys. It's what's known as efflorescence. And basically it is all the nutrients and minerals and everything from not only your nutrient solution, but from your just water in general, salts, things like that, build up over time. And then as the water evaporates out of the Leca, that is pulled to the surface and it deposits on the surface. So we don't like this. It's natural, it's gonna happen, you guys, but we don't wanna let it sit like this for a long period of time, because if we do, it can also lead to nutrient lockout. So we need to clean this. So you can, hold on, we got a cat visiting us trying to get into this plant. Let me relocate it. Hi, Scooter. So what we can do is we can just straight flush with water. Basically, that is going to involve, if you have a pot with actual drainage, just running water over it and letting it run through the bottom thoroughly to rinse everything out of that pot. If you do have plants in closed containers like this, you're going to do the same thing, but then you're going to have to cover it and tip it to drain that water out. I would do it a couple of times if you are in a no drainage system like this, just to make sure you're getting everything rinsed out. Now, you can also use something known as FloraClean, which I have tried on my plants as well. Honestly, I find it does a better job of cleaning off that efflorescence than just using water. Also, it's great if you do have some roots that have died off in the leca as well, because it kind of helps to, I guess sterilize would be the right way to describe it, things that are in that leca. So that is definitely something you can use. Now for the FloraClean, all you're gonna do is add 1 to 2 teaspoons per gallon of water. Once you've put it into that water, just make sure that you mix it in nice and thoroughly. And then this is what you use to flush the leca as opposed to just regular water. Now I would also recommend giving your cover pots, if you are using cover pots, a nice washout at the same time that you're doing this flush. Trying to steal the leca out of this plant. That you're doing this flush, just to make sure if there is anything funky going on in that pot that you have taken care of it. Now once you have done that, you are then going to mix up some more of your nutrient solution and you are going to add it back in, and then you will be good to go until 2 weeks later, when you will need to repeat this process again. And of course you will need to keep an eye on those water levels in between and top them off as needed. Do you want to say hi real quick, Scooter? Can we stop trying to steal my leca? You want to say hi? Say hi. I'm a leca thief today, but at least I'm a cute one. All right, little guy. Why don't you scoot over there and play with your toys? All right, you guys. So now I want to talk a little bit about the pros and cons of each of those systems that I had talked about. So obviously, like I said, this submerged no drainage is super easy to set up. Not exactly the easiest to maintain, just because you are having to tip it to dump the water out. Leca's inevitably going to escape unless you have a giant hand. And the other big downside is if you are growing a climbing plant. Scooter, please stop. 1 second, you guys. Okay, sorry about that, you guys. I think we're good to go now. What I was going to say was, if you are growing a climbing plant such as like the Monstera albo here, that is going to need a support or a pole, that plant's going to get real difficult to tip and drain out once you add a pole to it. So I definitely would not recommend this for that type of situation. Now, if it is just a plant that's going to stay in kind of a bushy type pattern and not get too big, this won't be that big of a deal to handle, all right? But if you are having issues or anything like that, what you can do as the second alternative would be to do the submerged with drainage. It's a lot easier to handle doing the flush and everything, because you just pick that pot with drainage up, stick it under the faucet, rinse out the reservoir, put it back in, and you're good to go. Now, the one other disadvantage, well, actually, let's go back to this real quick. Another disadvantage of this is algae. Algae can build up in here pretty fast because it is a clear container, but an easy solution around that is just to set this inside of a cover pot that's opaque, and that should help cut down on or resolve that issue completely. But another issue with both of these methods that I was talking about when they're submerged is that some plants do not like having their roots sitting in water basically at all for extended periods of time, and you could start to see root rot develop on those roots that are down below the surface of the water. So if you do have a plant that you're having a problem like that on, ideally you're going to want to move it to the third system, where it's getting the water wicked up and those roots are technically not going to be sitting in the actual water. I say technically because you know how it is. Some roots will grow down through the holes in the pot and get into the water, but you can always trim them back if you need to. So ideally, a lot of people say that the drainage with wicking is the best system. Obviously, you're not going to have an algae problem in that situation, but I find 2 drawbacks to it. One, the wicks can degrade over time. Microfiber less so. Microfiber wicks really shouldn't degrade, but cotton wicks will. But even if they don't degrade, they can get really funky and it's hard to get them cleaned, and you have to take the plant out and everything if you want to replace it. It's just a bit of a hassle. But the other downside is some plants really want more moisture than gets provided by that wick, because the wick has to absorb the water, and then the leca touching the wick has to absorb the water, and then the leca touching that leca has to absorb the water. So in my experience, it provides a drier environment than doing something like this or drainage with submersion. And that is why I honestly am not a huge fan of the wicking method for most plants. But for some plants, that is going to be how you have to go, or else you're probably going to run into an increased occurrence of dying off roots or root rot, if you will. Okay, so we have two more things to talk about. One is repotting plants that are in leca. So how do you know if you need to repot a plant that's in leca? And once again, you guys, do not repot your plants frequently. Like I said, some people say the roots should never go into the water. You don't want to be repotting every week or 2 weeks, which is what you would have to do to constantly maintain and change the position of the plant. That's just unreasonable. Really, the only times you need to repot is if you do see an increase in the amount of roots that are dying off to the point where you're like, whoa, they're all dying off and I don't see new ones taking their place, or if it looks like there is an actual root rot situation that has developed. In that situation, you're going to want to remove the plant from the leca. Some of the leca will probably be adhered to the roots. That's okay. You don't have to tug it off, but you want to basically treat it almost like a root rot situation, even if it is natural root loss. You want to take it out. You want to trim off all of the dead or dying roots until you just have healthy roots left. You're going to want to pot it back up, but you're going to want to give it a root rot treatment basically. So you're going to want to flush it with a hydrogen peroxide water mix to kill off anything bad that might be growing. If you think or are worried that it is like a really bad root rot situation, then in that case, you might want to remove all the leca, treat just the roots in that root rot bath, and then use clean, fresh leca to pot it back up in. If you are not experiencing that kind of thing, how do you know when you need to repot? Basically, if it gets root bound. So plants grown in leca can get root bound, just like you see plants grown in soil get root bound. And when that happens, there is less room for oxygen and things like that. So if you let it sit for too long, you will start to see leaves dying off, stunted growth, the same types of things you can see if a plant is left root bound for too long in soil as well. Now, when you do go to repot a plant that is root bound that's been growing in leca, you have several options. One, you can up pot it just like you would a plant in soil, just take it into a larger vessel with more leca. However, at a certain point, you guys, trying to find large pots and also having to buy the amount of leca you would need to be able to take it to a larger pot, never mind the sheer weight, increase in weight that is going to happen as you get larger growing in leca. This may not be the best option. You also may find that wherever your plant is sitting, you don't have room to take it into a bigger vessel. So at that point, you basically can just root prune the plant. So you're just going to trim back those roots so that it is a smaller root system, and you're just going to pot it back up in that leca, and you should be good to go. Now, the last thing I want to talk about is reusing leca, because one of the big benefits that I forgot to mention at the start of this video to using leca is that it is reusable. All you have to do to reuse it is basically sterilize it, and honestly, it's a pretty simple process. First thing you're going to want to do is make sure you have removed any and all organic material like stuck on roots, died off roots, bits of leaves that may have fallen in there, things like that. Make sure all of that has been removed. You're then going to place this into a pot. You are going to cover the leca with water till the water level is about maybe 1 inch or 2 inches above the line of the leca. You're going to pop that onto your stove. You're going to bring it to a boil, and you're going to let that boil for 10 minutes. You're then going to drain it out into a colander, and you are going to let it dry out completely, and then you can store it away for use another day, or you can pre-soak it for use the following day if you need to use it right away. Real simple solution. So that is basically the 101 rundown on leca, you guys. I will tell you right now, if I could grow them all in no drainage submersion like this would be my preference. It's very easy to see when the water level needs to be topped off. The problem with a lot of the reservoir systems, whether it's submerged or not submerged, is you can't see without going and picking the inside pot up if you need to add water to it. There are some pots like that that have a little window on the front where you can see the water level. Some pots do use the little meter that sticks out of the top as well. But if you're doing submersion, that meter is not a good guide because that meter stops right at the bottom of that pot. It doesn't actually go up into the pot to measure the water level, so you would still have to take it out and check it. It's a little bit of a hassle, but once again, for some plants, that's just how it's gonna have to be, especially if it's a plant that has a pole, because I'm not gonna try to tip a plant in something like this with a giant pole over to drain it out. It's gonna be a nightmare. But this is really what I personally have had the best luck with. The wicking has not been the most, I mean, my plants have done well in it, but they aren't thriving as well as the ones that I have in the submersion process, whether with drainage or without. And you know what? Only time will tell. I haven't put every type of plant possible into Leca, so I may find that I absolutely love the wicking for certain plants, but so far in my experience, it has just been like my least favorite out of all of them. But if you have experience in Leca and you have a preference, comment below and let us know. Or if you've tried something different that you absolutely love, definitely comment below and let us know. But I hope you guys have enjoyed this video today. If so, please click that like and or subscribe button, and I look forward to seeing you guys again next time. Aloha!